Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to be a continuation of a previous lesson from Mark's 10th chapter. We covered verses 17 through 31. Therein we read of the rich young ruler who comes with a question, and the range we're going to be covering today is verses 32 through 45, wherein he once more predicts his death, and then he reverses, and it's as a result of it, in response to a dialogue, he reverses the standard of and reduces ministry to the profoundest of all paradoxes. We'll get to that when we get to that. But one of the things we want to do first is review before what we already covered. This is stuff we may have covered in the preamble to the previous one, but in any case, in the opening verse, he's with the disciples, and he's at the borders of Judah, by the other side of the Jordan. So he is west of Judah right now, and he's en route to Jerusalem. He is on his walk to death, the third Passover of his mortal ministry, where he would be crucified. But we read that they turn towards Jerusalem, in the passage we'll be covering today. And he's teaching, he's doing what he normally does. Then in the crowd is a Pharisee who asks him a question about divorce, and he tells him, "What does Moses say?" And he recites the law, and then he explains the rationale and the purpose for which this law was written in the following words: "Because of the hardness of your heart, he wrote you this command. However, from the beginning of creation, Elohim made them male and female." And he quotes the Eden Genesis, "and two become one flesh," and so they are no longer two, but one flesh. So the divorce is a perversion and a corruption of God's intended order. And then he amplifies the sin of adultery to anyone who is divorced and remarries is guilty of adultery. So he really raises the bar. Then he's approached by a child, and the disciples try and shoo him away. They think the master has more important things to tend to, but he tells them, "Hinder them not, bring them to me. Truly I say to you, whoever does not receive the kingdom of Elohim as a little child shall certainly not enter into it." So children, in fact, have a lot to teach us in matters of salvation. We are to remember their childlike awe and wonder. We are to cultivate their virtues of simplicity, independence, and total reliance, and just we can if the dangers of maturing and sophistication will not save you. So the more sophisticated you come in your theological knowledge, you have to maintain and preserve the childlike humility, awe, and wonder which prompted the whole investigation to begin with. Then we read the story we already covered, the rich young ruler, by the combined accounts, and he has impeccable manners. He tells him, "Good teacher," a technically blasphemous claim, which is what Yahshua redresses him. So he wasn't denying his claim. He was just saying, "Do you know what you have just called me?" And he's asking him, "What must I do to inherit eternal life?" And there's two things wrong in that phrase. One, do, and two, inherit. Salvation is not a works process. Nevertheless, the Savior proceeds to introduce the Mosaic commandments, and he lays down the righteous ones. Conspicuously absent is the target in his length, the covetous, which is distinct from the adultery, murder, stealing, bearing false witness, defrauding, and respecting your father and mother, and that it is not an action, it is an attitude. So it is from these that he's given the command. He's saying, what lack I yet? All these I have followed from my youth. He has confidence in his commandment-keeping abilities. And then he wants to know what is missing. He senses that there is something missing, and he came with the right question. But when he gives the demand, one you lack, go sell all you possess and give to the poor, and you shall have treasure in the heavens. And come, follow me, taking up the cross. So he's inviting him to a life of his comfort, to a life of discomfort, but one where he will learn and grow and be saved. But he does not agree to the preconditions of selling all his stuff, because he had many possessions and he was in love with them. That was the chink in his armor, the covetousness, and he went away grieved. and sad, but then he uses this into a lesson, and he uses the eye of a needle of a camel to compare a camel, the largest of domesticated beasts, going through the needle of the eye of a needle. So we have the largest beast with the smallest possible eensy weensy window, and he compares the challenge of a rich man entering the kingdom in the heaven, and the disciples then asking who can be saved, and he says, with man it is impossible, but all things are possible with Elohim, or rather, that's in Luke's account, sorry. But in Mark's account, he closes with the paradoxical principle, many who are first shall be last, and the last first. Now, the rich young ruler was first in the world. He had everything going for him. He had his life. He was established in his synagogue. He was flourishing, but he was going to be last in the heaven. And the disciples who had forsook all, they were made winners by forsaking all. And then the actual lesson itself begins now, verse 32. And they were on the way going up to Jerusalem, and Yahshua was going before them. And they were astonished, and those who followed were afraid. And again he took his 12 aside, and began to say to them all that was about to befall him. So they're still in shock and awe. This bewilderment is a post-reaction, because what had just happened, they had heard him do the camel of the eye and assure them that what is impossible with man is possible for divinity's sake, and they are the disciples, and those who followed would have been the pilgrims. So they were en route to Passover. It was one of the three annual festivals where Jews throughout the diaspora were expected to make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, the capital city where they would all be gathered and assembled for those festive days. That he has something to tell that is sensitive information, so he draws the 12 aside from the crowd and tells them what is going to happen, why it must happen, and it will happen. And he does that in next verse. See, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man shall be delivered to the chief priests and to the scribes, and they shall condemn him to death, and shall deliver him to the Gentiles, and they shall mock him, and flog him, and spit on him, and kill him, and the third day he shall rise again. So he made it known that they were walking to his death. He was at death's door, and they were walking, literally inching towards the precipice while they were en route, and everything happened just like he said. He was tried in the Jewish tribunal. They indicted him on the sin of blasphemy through a trick question with an ambiguous answer, really. And, the Jewish people, unfortunately, could not inflict capital punishment unless it was at the permission of their Roman overlords. But they want him to go to the cross. They don't want to stone him, which was the Mosaic law. They wanted the cross for him. They wanted to make an example with him, so they delivered him to the Gentiles. That would have been the Romans, and what they said to him was something different from what they said to each other. What they said to each other was that he was blaspheming. He said he was going to be seated at the right hand of the Father, and the positions of the seating incidentally formed a question of the sons of Zebedee, James and John, and they mocked him and spat on him and just degraded and humiliated him in public. That was the bitter passion. But on the third day he will rise and resurrect. And what's curious in this example is that there is no reaction from them. We can imagine they may have been muted, but in some accounts they say that it just didn't sink in, and I think that's maybe what happens here, because then they're we read that the sons of Zebedee are talking about something completely removed from what he has to go through. And James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came to him, saying, Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask. Now, as disciples, we are entitled to that promise, but that promise is contingent on his will for us. No righteous request will he deny, but their request wasn't really aligned with the will of the Father, and the Son, who was aligned with it, tells them it's not for me to decide the question they're going to answered them, and he said to them, "What do you want me to do for you?" And they said to him, "Grant us to be seated in your esteem, one on your right hand and the other on your left." So they're asking a pretty tall request. They're asking for a shortcut to his right hand and left hand, but he tells them there are no shortcuts. He's eventually going to answer them, "Are you prepared? Do you really know the baptism of blood that I'm going to be baptized in? Are you ready to do this?" And the obvious answer is no, not yet at least, but they were. I think James was the first to die, as recorded in Acts 12, the first martyred apostle, and John was the sole survivor. He expired in the Isle of Patmos, where he wrote the book of Revelation. But there are no shortcuts to heaven, and there are no shortcuts. If there was a cross in his life, then those who call him disciples have no right or reasonable expectation not for them to be one in there. So the cross comes in all our lives, and it's never as excruciating or agonizing as a literal cross, but there is an ordeal, and we do have to bear crosses in our lives no matter what. But Yahshua said to them, "You do not know what you ask. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink and be baptized with the baptism I am baptized with?" So the drink of the cup of wine, is an Old Testament symbolism for the judgment and justice of Yahweh or Elohim. But he refers to the cup in the Garden of Gethsemane, the cup, the medicine that he was about to take, and it was tough for him to swallow. So what does he do? He asks his Father to take this cup from me. Nevertheless, not as I. If there was any other way that mankind could be saved, please don't let me go through what I have to go through now. Nevertheless, not what I will, but thine will be done. So that was his embracement of the cup. Now that's a tall thing to ask for your disciples, especially ones who have this commercialized, corrupted, mass media, whatever, vision of the Messiah, mass culture. The Jewish people at this time envisioned a Messiah who would be a liberating conqueror of the Gentiles, who would restore them to their former glory, much as it was they envisioned a Davidic king arising and emerging and smiting the Gentiles, but that just wasn't he was the suffering servant. So of this lesson the pastor we're going to cover on, he calls himself a servant, and this connects to the suffering. So he was a suffering servant, and by his suffering we are paradoxically comforted. Not only today the atonement has present value, but also eternally. And they say to him, "We are able." And Yahshua said to them, "You shall indeed drink the cup that I drink, and with the baptism I am baptized with, you shall be baptized." So he knows that they don't know what he's talking about, but he assures them that they will eventually be called to die for him. John was, according to legend, tossed into a pot of boiling water, yet miraculously survived. So he did, embrace the martyr's call, but escape the fate, shall we say. But, they don't quite know what he's talking about. The baptism is not a baptism of water where, the dove was present in the form of the Spirit, or Spirit in the form of the dove, rather, and the Father's voice of approval was there. And when he was on the cross, he was separated from his Father, and that was the most exquisite agony. It wasn't the physical pain. He was flesh and blood, just like you and I. You put the nails in his hands, it hurt. But what really hurt him, caused him the most pain, was the spiritual suffering. In the moment in time he became sin, and the Father looked away with disgust. And so he says, "Why hast thou forsaken me?" Matthew 27:46, originally in the 22nd Psalm, first verse. "But to sit on my right hand and on my left is not mine to give, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared." So the Son knows his place. He knows that it's not for him to decide. He is at the mercy, beck and call, and doing everything on behalf and at the behest of the Father, to whom he is functionally subordinate. He is equal in essence and attributes, at least now, not in the incarnation. He had to surrender temporarily a lot of them, and there's a lot of things he didn't know, such as the hour of his return, at least in the flesh. And when he came in resurrected form, he told the disciples not to waste time in idle speculation about the day of my arrival. But, once more, it's all in the Father's hands. I'm in his hands. I have the intimate access that you kind of have towards me, at least in relation to the rest of the world. And when the 10 heard it, they began to be sorely displeased with James and John. So the disciples over here, they're not far away. Remember, he's in the company of the 12 when he's saying this, and they're envious, and they're missing the whole point too. Just like them, they want what they ask, and they're jealous and mad at them. They are bitter at them for asking what they would have liked to ask. They didn't have the upfrontery as them, but they all wanted the same thing. So they were still struggling at this time to envision the suffering servant and the model of ministry that he came to embody, that they were to emulate. They were looking around. Now, when you are surrounded by greatness, the greatness of Rome, you don't want that to define your concept of greatness. How the divinity defines greatness is paradoxical. We'll get to that soon. And Yahshua, calling them near, said to them, "You know that those who think to rule the Gentiles are masters over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them." So the way of the Gentiles is also the way of, the sinners. But he's speaking of their Gentile overlords, the Greeks, the Romans, and just about anyone else. The age of the Gentiles had come in 586, and we've been living in it ever since. And, the way of the world is, powerful men. Their power and greatness is measured by how many men they dominate and lord over and own and just have in possession. But greatness, as God defines it, is something different than that. But it is not so among you, but whoever wants to become great among you shall be your servant. So greatness is foundationed on the what the world considers the inferior subordinate station, but that is the economy of the church. At the top and at the head in the leadership is one, the great shepherd, and then we who pastor are underling under shepherds, but it all ties back and stems to him. And if he was our servant and he came to suffer as our suffering servant, then we must suffer with and for the flock that he has entrusted amongst us in our respective jurisdictions. And whoever wants to be first among you shall be servant of all. So in order to become the greatest, that's the first among you, that's the best seat at the table, that's the most prominent position in the club, you must have to humble yourself as a servant before you attain the greatness. So before the splendor had to come the suffering, before the crown had to come the cross, and if it was that way with him, then it must be that way with us if we are to meet him in salvation. So we have to, not think of ourselves as lords and rulers, but servants. Leadership is the world measures leaders by how many servants they have, but the church measures leadership by how much they serve. So we are servants and not lords. We're leaders, but not lords. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. Now, by definition, God is self-existent, self-sustaining, and self-created. Therefore, by definition, he needs nothing. So he does not need us to be, he did not need us to be born. He did not create out of necessity, nor does he save us out of necessity. He does it out of want and desire. But what does this have to do with the passage? And answer to that question is that you know what, I actually don't know, but I've come too far, so I'm just going to keep going. But, you know, the ransom is he ransomed us from the bondage of sin and everything else, and it was for many. So even though his atoning blood is sufficient for the entire world, it is only efficient for those who exercise saving faith in the doctrine. And, you know, if the Son of Man did not come to serve, but to tie it into the earlier thought, but to serve, he does not need servants, but he works his way through servants, but he himself considered himself a servant. So by the paradox, our leaders are really servants. Our greatest leader was our greatest servant, and he is the one we call master, yet he called himself a servant. And that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. Glad I caught hold of that thought. It just happened, but that's all the time we have for today. I'll see you soon. Take care until then. Bye-bye.